Welcome to Books, Beauty, and Business. Our goal is to inspire, motivate, and encourage others through laughter, accountability, success stories, and most importantly, easy steps for achieving greatness. My name is Tani Bro, and today I'd like to introduce you to our guest, J.D. Barker, author of thrillers like Forsaken, The Fourth Monkey, and Dracula, which was co-written with Bram Stoker's family using Bram's original notes. A master of suspense, J.D. Works has topped bestseller lists, and Dracula is currently being developed for a film by Paramount. He's also collaborated with James Patterson, making him a powerhouse in the literary world. Let's dive into his fascinating journey. Well, welcome, JD. We're so excited to have you here, and we're very excited to hear your story today. How's everything going?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing very well. So it's been really fun to kind of follow along with the books that you've written and the things that you've done and things that you have going on. So can you just tell us a little bit about your story and how you got started writing?
Wow. Let me try to come up with a Cliff Notes version.
Yeah.
So I grew up reading. We didn't have a TV in the house, so I was hitting the library at a very early age. Started reading probably around 3. By the time I got into kindergarten, I'd read like all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews and moved on to Charles Dickens. And my sister, who is 15 months younger than me, we used to write stories for each other. And like I would staple them together, and I had like a little library in my room, and she would check out the stories. I would charge her late fees, and that's kind of where it all started. But my parents they encouraged the writing thing, but it always had a disclaimer, like writing is a fun hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You need to get a real job. So like many of us, I finished up high school, I went into college, and started down the road to the corporate life. I ended up with degrees in business, another one in finance. I got halfway through a psychology degree, and I was working for a brokerage firm as a chief compliance officer, which was basically my day job, and it absolutely sucked. I hated every second of it. But the salary was really good. And over time, I just kind of got trapped. And I would come home at night and I would write to stay sane. And years back, I used to work for RCA Records. I was basically a glorified babysitter in the Fort Lauderdale area. So if they had a recording artist that came into town, I'd have to pick them up at the airport, get them to the radio station for their interview, get them to their concert, get them to their hotel, that sort of thing. And that's kind of where I first broke into writing. I would take those people while I had them in the car and I would interview them and then sell those interviews back to magazines like 17 and Teen People. To really date myself, this was people like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson and New Kids on the
Yeah.
Block, then a bunch of hair bands. But that's essentially how I broke into this. So I would, come home. I, finished up school. I did that during the daytime. Went to the corporate world, did that during the daytime. But at night, that was always all about the writing. Um, and for about 2 decades, that's more or less how I lived my life. I would come home and I would work on other people's books, and I basically had a side hustle as a ghostwriter and a book doctor. And over that time, I had 6 different books that ended up hitting the New York Times list, all with other people's names on the cover that I had written, which gets old after a while.
Wow. You knew from a very young age then that you were this dream to be a writer. I mean, reading at 3 and checking books out of your out of your bedroom library, like that's an amazing story. And it makes sense, like with what a lot of people have to do, like as they kind of squish that dream for reality in life and getting into the would you say compliance world?
Yes, I was a chief compliance officer. So what that basically means is I had to make sure that every transaction that passed through the brokerage firm didn't violate any state or federal securities regulations,
Uh-huh.
which is a horrible job. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. But like I mentioned, like the salary was really good, so I got stuck. And it's
Mhm.
very easy for this to happen. Before I knew it, I had a house, I had cars, we had a boat. And our monthly nut was around $12,000 a month just to get by. So I couldn't just walk away from that day job. But my wife, like, she knew that I wanted to be a writer. And, like I mentioned, the couple of books that hit the New York Times list, when that 6-1 hit, she pulled me aside and said, we need to come up with a plan to take this career to like another level. So she
Yes.
came up with this crazy idea. We ended up selling everything that we owned. We bought a duplex in Pittsburgh. She had family there, so we bought this tiny little duplex. We rented out one side to some tenants. We lived in the other side, and basically got our expenses down to next to nothing, so that I could try to write that first book. And I remember her sitting me down at the kitchen table, and she showed me our bank statement, and she said, "You got about maybe 18 months to make this work. Go." And nothing like putting your feet to the fire. And I think I
Yeah.
really needed that because
Uh-huh.
without that, I would probably still be working that job that I hated.
Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, this sounds like a movie. So, how did it go? I need to know the ending. Obviously, you're here today. Like, was it that 18 months? Like you kicked it into gear, or was it a
Yeah,
challenge?
I had a series of things that just kind of came together really well. So when I wrote the first book, and I imagine your listeners are a lot of authors, so like we all know, like getting to that last page is the hardest part. So just get that last page down on paper. I had to explain where the wife bought a journal, and I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store from his book, and fully expected to have to change that. But my wife read it and she said, let's try and get King's permission to use this before you change it. And ultimately, I was able to do that. I ended up sending the first book out to a number of agents, and I didn't really get a whole lot of bites. And it was mainly because I just didn't follow the process. I sent like to whom it may concern letters. Like I didn't bother to go to their website to figure out what their specs were or what they wanted. So ultimately I ended up self-publishing the book, but I sold about 250,000 copies of it, which was enough to put me on the radar of the traditional publishers. So when I wrote my second one, it was a lot easier to get an actual traditional deal. I ended up scoring a seven-figure deal with a TV show and a movie attached to it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Like props to your wife too for stepping in and saying, "Hey, like let's follow this dream." Because you could have,
Yeah, yeah.
you'd
None
still be
none of
stuck.
this would have happened
Yeah.
without and one of the other things that she brought up, working in the music business, I had seen so many people that had, they had like a one-hit wonder kind of situation. They
Mhm.
did really good out of the gate and just kind of expected it to continue. So they just started spending money like crazy. They bought like a big house on South Beach. They would get the car, they'd be in the clubs every night, spending all this money. And before you knew it, it was gone. Their second song came out. It didn't go anywhere. Their career kind of fizzled and died. I was deathly afraid that was going to happen with my writing career. So when the money started coming in from the books, rather than put it into our checking account, we turned around and we bought real estate. We ended up buying a bunch of rental properties. So we basically created passive income, which ultimately turned into another side gig that my wife runs today. We've got, I think, 12 properties at this point, that we
Oh,
have on like
that's so
VRBO and
nice.
Airbnb. Yeah, so
Well,
it's
that
just
takes a
a
little
way to
pressure.
diversify.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Diversify. It takes a little pressure off you. And without that pressure, you can be a little more creative, and then, continue writing, I'd imagine.
So it's been kind of a dream since then. I had a number of books I did through the traditional publishers. Then I kind of created a hybrid approach because if you publish indie, you realize that the economics of that are really strong. They're in your favor. You get roughly about 70 cents on the dollar. On the traditional side, it's fantastic because they give you a nice big check up front. But what they don't tell you is you have to pay that money back. It's just in advance, and a lot of times you're paying it back at like 15 to 20 cents on the dollar. So you have to sell a lot of books in order to pay that money back. So when I started, after selling a couple into the traditional world, I didn't really need that big payday anymore. I started looking at the economics of it and realized that it made a lot more sense for me to indie publish some of these titles. So I ended up going back to my agent and I said, I'll let you sell the foreign rights, but I'm going to retain English for myself. So I ended up publishing three books that way, where I published in the U.S., Canada, UK, any place in English, and then we sold all the foreign territories. And I'm in 150 different countries at this point, probably about 30 different languages. So it was still a pretty wide market, and that worked out really well for a while there. With my last book, my latest one is called Behind a Closed Door. It came out in May. My agent took it out to the publishers, and a weird thing happened. It was about to go to auction. We started getting a lot of interest on the film and TV side, so it looked like a movie was going to happen. And the publishers started to weigh in. And whenever you have multiple publishers that want a book, it goes to auction. So we got to that point, and I got a phone call from a friend of mine who worked at Random House, and she said, "Listen, we're about to make an offer on your book, and when that happens, you need to turn it down." And I asked why, and she said, "Well, Penguin Random House is about to lay off a lot of people, and the editor that wants your book is one of them." And about a week later, I got a similar phone call from somebody at HarperCollins, and then all those layoffs ended up happening, over the summer. A lot of people were let go from a lot of the traditional publishers. So I reached out through back channels to a friend of mine that worked in private equity to the firm that bought Simon and Schuster. And ultimately, I ended up striking a deal with them where I created my own imprint through Simon and Schuster. So I basically have my own publishing house with Simon and Schuster handling my print sales and distribution, which is how we put out the last title.
Wow. Talk about the doors opening at the right time and letting you like make those decisions to move forward to the next one. That's amazing. Cause like The stars have to line up just perfectly for all those steps to happen to get you here today. That's amazing. So, what's the hardest part about being an author?
Probably the marketing side.
Mm,
Just having to deal with that. I mean, I think in Hollywood they kind of paint authors, they always have the same picture. The author is kind of sitting in a little office by themselves. They write their book, they drop it in the box and mail it off to their agent, and then they're kind of done. They don't have to do anything until the next one. In reality, it's not like that. Like I'm done writing every day, probably about 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning, and then I flip on the switch to let my email come in. I turn the internet off whenever I'm writing because it just distracts me. And the business side of this whole thing kind of creeps in, and there's a lot involved on the business end. I spend the bulk of my hours dealing with that on a day-to-day basis.
mm.
And when you're in multiple countries, you're dealing with it over and over again in different places.
Well, your compliance background probably is helping you out. All
It
the
it
business
does.
stuff you did helps you out a little bit today and dealing with all of that, right?
Yeah, it definitely helps keep me on track. I've always been a very organized person.
Mhm.
So from that standpoint, it's okay. It's just, I would love to be able to just lock myself in my room and do nothing but the writing. I think most writers were very introverted, right? Like we don't want to get out there in front of other people, but it's a necessary evil in order to get ahead in this profession.
Yes. Well, it sounds like you're dealing with it well. Staying organized is a big key to that. You're ahead of the game there. So, what's your best advice for people who just dream of writing and getting to the place you are now?
And the number one thing I tell everybody is just to write every day. Even when I was working in the corporate world, I was doing 60 to 80 hours a week, but I would find time to crank out 200 to 300 words. And that could be at my lunch hour. Sometimes it was standing in line at the grocery store, wherever I could, but I made sure I got something on paper every day. And if you do 200 to 300 words a day, that's a novel in a year. So it's very doable. I think I've seen a lot of people where they, tell themselves they're going to write like on weekends. I'll write on Saturday, and they try to do that, and you can try to do that. But the problem is so much time goes by between each writing session, you kind of lose where you're at. Takes a lot longer to complete the book, and the voice, your writer voice actually changes from start to finish because it takes so long to get to the finish line on something like that. Writing to me is very much like going to the gym. It's like exercising. It's a muscle that you have to work every single day, and the more you do it, the easier it gets. So I think writing every day is key. I learned a couple little tips and tricks though back then that I used to do all the time. So I listen to a thunderstorm soundtrack whenever I write. It's basically just white noise, but I used to do that from the get go, and it's a Pavlov's dog thing. Like every time I hear that sound, my brain immediately goes into writer's mode. So I just put my headphones on. It doesn't matter where I am. If I hear that sound, I know it's time to write. The other thing I do is I try to leave off like in the middle of a sentence. I basically know what's coming next. And it basically alleviates writer's block by doing that because, I get up from my desk, but I know what's going to happen in the story next. My brain doesn't worry about it. Instead, I just kind of think about, where the story is going. And then the next day I just sit down and kind of keep running. Which makes it a lot easier. I've got so many friends that like they would kind of write until the well went dry. They'd have these marathon sessions. They would crank out 3,000, 6,000 words, 10,000 words. They're at their desk from 8 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, and then they just kind of push back and they're exhausted. They've got nothing left. And then the next day they sit down to try and continue that story, and they're burned out. They stare at a blank screen for hours at a time to try and get back into it. I think you have to learn your limits. And everything changes, over time. It's if you're, most people when they're first starting off, they're working a day job, so you have to find the time to do it. But I think you can find, just a couple minutes here, a couple minutes there, you can get it done.
That is such great advice. There's so much to unpack there with that type of advice. I'm curious, because you're an author and you're always writing for your work. Do you ever just like journal for yourself?
I've tried that, and I'm just no good at it. You know, my wife does, even my daughter to a certain extent, it writes those
Mhm.
types of things down. But I've never been able to do it. I like the idea of journaling,
Mhm.
but I guess I feel like it's from my standpoint, it's just not productive. Like if I put 200,000, 200 words into a journal, that's a page that I could have put into the latest novel.
Yep.
And it's almost like there's a limited number of words, and I need to make sure I put them in the right spot.
Gotcha. That makes sense. That makes sense too. I was curious if you did that. So what this is kind of a trick question as an author, but what is your favorite book?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, from the ones that I've written, it always tends to be my latest. That's sort of like asking somebody who your favorite kid is. From a reading standpoint, I think
Mhm.
my favorite book of all time is probably Great Expectations from Charles Dickens.
Okay.
Yeah, I just it's one that I read when I was a kid, and like it has always stuck with me.
That's a good classic. That's a good one. That's a good one. Do you ever have again, tough for a writer to answer some of these, but do you ever have like a book you would recommend for somebody that's getting into writing? Like not something that you would recommend them to read first?
I've got, you can see my bookshelf behind me, like all those books. There's only two on there on the shelves that are actually on the subject of writing.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is Strunk and White, which is a tiny little book. It's only about a quarter inch thick, but it gives you everything you need from the grammar perspective, like every rule related to grammar. I can't for the life of me figure out why our English books in school were like, 3 inches thick and weighed like 40 pounds every single year. Cause like everything you need is in this little Strunk and White book. The other one I have is On Writing by Stephen King. That's kind of my holy grail.
Mm-hmm.
I read that when I first got into fiction, and I revisit it every couple of years. I'm a big fan of the audiobook because Stephen King actually reads it, so it's kind of like him telling you his process. But it gives you everything you need, I think, from a craft standpoint to get going.
I love that. I'm writing this down. This is good. This is good stuff. So, okay, so we are books, beauty, and business. So, do you have just keeping yourself sane, you know, being so busy and having so many things going on? Is there any favorite tip that you like just around self-care, like what you do for yourself? I'd say beauty tip, but we'll call it self-care for you.
Yeah, I go for a run every day. I live on a little island off the coast of Portsmouth up in New England. So I do a lap around the island. It's about 4.25 miles. Just gives me a chance to completely clear my head. I stop my business day every day at 3 p.m. One of the things that really crept up on me when I first started selling books, particularly in other countries, is interviews would come in at like random times. So I would have to do an interview at like 11 o'clock at night or 1 o'clock in the morning to deal with local time wherever the interview was airing. And that just, I quickly learned wasn't sustainable. I just wasn't getting any sleep. So like I have a hard stop on my business day at 3 p.m. So like everything related to the business has to happen before 3 p.m. or I just don't do it.
Mm,
I think that's kind of important. So 3 o'clock, I leave my office, I go for that run. And when I get home, I spend the rest of the night with my wife and daughter and just try to enjoy family.
I love that. That's the ultimate goal of balance, right?
Yeah,
If there's ever
balance
such a
is
thing.
important.
Yeah.
I mean, because when you write full time, you're like, I'm in my office is in my house. Like I could easily lock myself in here. I've gotten to know a guy named Dean Koontz over the years,
Hmm.
thriller writer that's been around forever. Yeah, like he's coming up on 80 years old, and like he will lock himself in his office for days at a time, knocking out his next novel, like to the point where his wife is sliding food under the door for him. And like to me, like that's just like what's the point of like that? Like you have to take a step back, I think, and enjoy it a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's crazy. Okay. Well, this has been really fun. I've really enjoyed learning about your story and learning about, all the fun things that you've done, and the advice has been amazing. Do you have any last minute words for our writers out there?
Nah, just keep at it. I mean, my life literally changed in one day. My first book sold really well as an indie title, but my agent had taken out the second book, which is called The Fourth Monkey, a thriller based in Chicago. She called me one day when I was on a run, and she said, "Hey, we just got a preemptive offer out of the UK for $160,000." By the time I got back to the house, that number had increased. I took my wife out to dinner, and by the time that night ended, we had broke seven figures. So like that can happen to anybody listening to this show. Like the day before that, I wasn't sure if the book was going to sell at all. So you just don't know. And when those kind of things happen, just jump all over them, take advantage of them, and try to figure out how to use that to take yourself to the next level.
That's incredible. That's an incredible story. And I wish you all the best of luck. Where can we find your latest book?
Latest book is called Heavier the Stones. I wrote it with a woman named Christine Daigle. She's a neuropsychologist. And it just released on November 26th, and you can find that in any bookstore. I'm at jdbarker.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking time and talking with the audience today. We really appreciate it. And for all of you listening out there, you will find all of his links and information below. So make sure to follow and leave reviews. Thank you so much. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.